This is a closer look at Sonata-Allegro form for musical composition. Now, just to clear up a common misconception, there is no sonata form. Might not seem like a big deal, but a sonata refers to the overall work, all the movements, none of which may follow Sonata-Allegro form. You can have one movement or four or five. So Sonata-Allegro form specifically refers to a layout of the thematic material. And we have it broken down into three main sections, which I'll show here. The first is called the Exposition. Then we have the Development, and then the Recapitulation. Those are the three main sections, and we'll go through each of those and what they do for the piece. The Exposition is primarily made up of two main themes. We're going to call them, for the sake of continuity, the primary and subordinate theme. And the most important thing is that they contrast each other. So that's both in key and mood. They don't have to be in different keys or moods, but at least one of those should be different. And what was common practice in the 1700s, at least, was to write the subordinate theme in the relative major of the primary theme. And we'll look at an example from a Haydn sonata as far as that goes. But before we do, we also have the option of having an introductory theme, which is not associated with the other two, and its purpose may be to introduce the atmosphere of the piece or a mood, or just to establish a tonal center. But the main two themes, the primary and subordinate themes, we're going to look at this Haydn sonata in E minor. So the first theme, the primary theme, is in E minor. And notice not just the key that it's written in, but also the mood. How the left hand in particular is very non-legato. In fact, it's marcato. So that's the primary theme. Now notice the contrast between that, both in mood and key, and then the subordinate theme. So did you notice the big difference there? So here under Exposition we have 1 and 2, the primary and subordinate. We can also have in between here, we can have bridge phrases. We can even have what's called a codetta, a smaller version of the coda. The coda we'll talk about at the end. It's not really one of the three main sections, but it serves a purpose. But as far as the Exposition goes, the principal themes are that we have two main sections, or two main themes, the primary and subordinate, and they need to contrast each other so that we can develop them later on. So now that we've ended the Exposition, we have the option of repeating those to establish familiar themes, or now we can go on to the development. Now, there are several different ways that we can do this. The option, it's optional which way we choose. In the Fifth Symphony of Mahler, he chooses a very obvious change into the development section, because it's in C sharp minor, very somber and serious. And at the end of the Exposition, he begins the principal theme again, which, if we haven't heard it before, we might expect it to do the same thing as in the beginning. But now he begins it, and there's a little pause, and then he takes it off into the development. He marks it plötzlich schneller, leidenschaftlich und wild, which means suddenly fast, passionate and wild. Now, when he does that change, it's very obvious. if you're not familiar with the piece, I highly recommend listening to George Schulte's recording of it. But another option we have is to do a more subtle change, as we see in the 10th Symphony of Shostakovich, which is an outstanding piece. In fact, if you haven't heard it, Herbert von Karajan has the best, I think, recording of it. But you almost can't even tell when he goes into the development section. Now, we're not going to talk about the development too much, because basically that's free reign for the composer to develop those themes as we please. So that's why it's so important for those themes to contrast each other, because it gives us more material to work with. Now, as we get into our third section, while we have the option of being subtle or making it very obvious between the exposition and development, when we get into the recapitulation, we need to make it very clear that we're re-establishing the primary theme in the same manner as at the beginning. Now, it can be more elaborate, more embellished, but it needs to be obvious that we're re-establishing the main theme. Now, while the subordinate theme in the exposition was in a different key than the primary theme, the subordinate theme now in the recapitulation almost always is going to be in the tonic, the same key as the primary theme. Now, once we're done here with the recapitulation, once we've established, and the reason the subordinate theme now is in the tonic, the same key as the primary theme, is to establish the tonal center, to make sure that people know that that's the key that we're in. We're not having that conflict between the themes now. Sometimes, though, that's not enough for the end of the piece, so then we add what's called a coda. It ties up loose ends, musically speaking. Now, what that means is if it's not a satisfying conclusion just stating the primary and subordinate themes, we might have to use some material from early on, or even introduce some new material to bring the piece to a satisfying conclusion. One effective thing to do is to end the piece the same way that it begins, like we see in the Liszt Sonata. He begins in the same very quiet way that or he ends it in the same quiet way that he begins it. One technique that I particularly like is to use an introductory theme it's separate from the two main themes, and then use that same introductory theme to end the piece. But the main principles, just to go over the main ideas again, we have the primary and subordinate themes that contrast each other in the exposition, then the development of any of that material in the, sometimes it's called the transition in development, and then we reestablish the primary and subordinate themes both in the tonic in the recapitulation. So those are the main ideas behind Sonata-Allegro form.